This video is brought to you by the AvTech Institute of Technology, providing continuous talent development for organizations and individual professionals.
My name is Dan Loveland. I am the Director of Project Management for Atlantic City Electric and for Delmarva Power and Light, two of the three utilities that make up PHI, which is a subsidiary of Exelon. With me today to accept the award is John Travaglini, the one who did all the work on the job, along with his project team. I'm going to go over a little bit of what Atlantic Electric is as a company, what we do, some of our generic information about the types of projects that we've been doing here. And then John's going to take you through the particulars of the project. So Atlantic Electric is a transmission and distribution utility in southern New Jersey. Can we switch to the, there we go, thank you. We serve about 560,000 customers across 8 counties in the southern part of New Jersey. You can see we're pretty much from the river to the beach, with the exception of the Vineland area where they have a municipal electric utility. Some interesting points about Atlantic Electric that make us unique. We are, as I said, about 560,000 customers spread across 2,800 square miles. When you compare that to PMINJ with 2.1 million customers in 2,600 square miles, our density of customers isn't quite the same. And so that leads to a lot of the decisions we make about how to serve our customers. We have about 560 employees in the company. 400 plus of those are part of Local 210, our internal union. And we do have 90 substations. We'll get to a little bit more about what that means in a minute. We are very engaged in our community, as are all of the Exelon companies. We work with about 300 local charitable organizations across the 8 counties. Go to the next slide, please. We'll just go over basics of what our utility operations look like. Go right to the next slide, John. So at a high level, what happens in the electric industry today is the same as it's always been, except that we've kind of changed the model for how the businesses fit. So power is generated at a generating station. It's generated at a voltage that you can control it in the station. So then it's stepped up to a transmission voltage, sent across the transmission lines, the things that folks are used to seeing on the side of the road that look like the Transformers movie. Then it goes to local substations where it's stepped down to a distribution voltage and then ultimately to the home. Where Atlantic Electric fits in is we take over at some point between points 2 and 3. And depending on where the point of interconnection is, we'll pick up at a transmission class voltage, carry the power to the local area, then step it down in the neighborhood to feed the customers. The project that we're dealing with today is really between points 3 and 4. So it's a transmission path that gets us from a larger substation into a local substation so we can feed our customers. Let's go to the next slide. You'll hear more from John in a few minutes about the system that's installed here. Traditionally, when you look at our poles that are supporting our conductors, the path to the customer, what most folks have seen are the wood poles on the left and the lattice towers in the middle. The project that we're talking about today is really the use of these steel monopoles. The picture here is of a galvanized steel monopole. The actual project, we used a pre-weathered or a pre-rusted structure so that it has less visual impact on the community. We moved from wood poles to these steel monopoles in order to meet the challenges that we faced recently with the storms. The steel monopoles that were installed here are rated to 125-mile-an-hour wind loading. The lattice towers that you see in the middle, they're traditionally used for voltages above 100,000 volts. In this case, we're dealing with a 69,000 volt system or transmission line. Historically, it was on wood poles. We've moved it over to the steel monopoles. Go to the next slide, John. Some of the complexities of how you put the steel monopoles in the ground really kind of come down to how you're going to support it. And there's a lot that goes into engineering each and every one of the poles that went into this project. So what you see in this slide are, down at the bottom, 3 different types of foundations that we use: direct embedded, drilled piers, and piles or pile cap foundations. So the direct embedded are the simplest form to put up. They do well on the straight line path, but once it gets into an angle, it becomes more of a challenge in order to meet the physical load requirements for the pole. So we would then switch over, in this case, to the drilled pier foundations. The pile cap foundations, we've used those on projects in the area recently. They're far more complex, and they're put in when we have really complex loading situations. This project had enough challenges. Fortunately, we didn't have to use the pile cap foundations here. When you're putting a pole in the ground or putting a foundation in the ground, there's a couple ways that we can do it. It depends on the soil condition. So we can either drill a hole and stick the foundation in, or we can vibrate the caisson in. That's what you see in the picture up on the top there. In this case, we use a combination of drilled and vibrated foundations. Next slide, John. At the top of the pole, the reason that we put the pole in the air is the conductor. There's 2 broadly used types of conductors for transmission. The all aluminum conductor that you see at the top left-hand side here, while it carries a lot of current, one of the challenges with it is the physical strength of the wire. In this case, in order to meet the loading requirements, this is not atypical for our service territory, we used an aluminum conductor with steel reinforcement that allows the conductor to hold up to stronger winds and the potential for flying debris. And then on the right, you see the brace post and the post insulators. So that's the way that we attach to the pole. There's a lot of information that we've been gathering. We have a very strong environmental team that allows us to move through our projects very well. Part of that environmental team is an avian protection specialist that helps us to make sure that what we're building will have as minimum impact as we can on the avian population in our area. And then on the right, you see glass and suspension type insulators. That's how we hang our conductors. So the brace post and the post attachments then lead to the glass or the suspension insulator, and that's how we connect the wire. We're going to go now to a video that shows the basics of how the pole's constructed. John, you want to cue that up? So this was done by Skyscape. We've been using a lot of drones recently. The top of the pole here, you see the OPGW, which is our fiber plus our ground wire. Then the 3 phases that make up the transmission path. Then below that is the distribution voltage, class 12,000 volts. Then we have our neutral, and then below that is where the communications connect. So there's a lot that's on that pole. It's laid out in order to make sure that the folks that are working on it can work safely. If you go from the ground up, the lowest voltage pieces are at the bottom, the highest voltage at the top, so that the folks who are qualified to work on lower voltages can work on those portions of the pole. So if there are no questions, I'll turn it over to John.
No questions yet.
All right. Go ahead, John.
Very good. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, everyone, for joining us on your Saturday afternoon as we share our project story. Again, my name is John Travellini, project manager for Atlantic City Electric. And from here, I'd like to go into detail about our Salem to Woodstown 69kv transmission line rebuild, which is the 69,000 volt line. And I'll touch on project management methodologies, challenges faced by the project team, as well as lessons learned. Good minutes. Good. Some background on the project. The Salem to Woodstown 69kv line rebuild is a 10.9 mile electric transmission line rebuild project in Salem County, New Jersey. Project was classified as a reliability improvement project driven by age and condition of the existing facilities. By existing facilities, I'm referring to the pole structures, conductor, insulators, and so on that were in service prior to rebuild of the transmission line. Prior to the recently completed rebuild, records indicated that the wood pole line was originally constructed in the 1930s. Atlantic City Electric utilizes a quantitative methodology, a risk model tool to identify system needs and associated prioritization of capital investment. And based on the detailed inspections of the facilities, the age and physical condition of the circuit, as well as performance history, the Salem-Woodstown circuit ranked #1 in our system for age and condition in this risk model tool. And this prioritization served as justification for implementation of the capital project, that is our Salem-Woodstown reliability project. Also worth noting is that a large industrial customer served off of its circuit, which was taken into consideration with any planned outages and associated work on the transmission line. Months ahead of the start of the planned Salem-Woodstown line outage, Atlantic City Electric developed and implemented a high-risk evolution plan as part of the outage required for the transmission line rebuild. And as part of this high-risk evolution plan, or HRE, the project team planned and ensured that various activities were completed prior to during the transmission line outage. For example, that inspections and repairs were completed on the other circuits that remained energized and were carrying load during the Salem-Woodstown transmission line. That vegetation management, for example, tree trimming, was completed. Preventive maintenance on substation equipment was up to date. Communications with our maintenance crews and system operations to prevent operation of specific devices so as to avoid service disruptions while the Salem-Woodstown circuit would be de-energized for the rebuild. The project team also took into consideration contingency plans, for example, in an emergent situation if load needed to be transferred. So once the circuit was de-energized, construction of the Salem-Woodstown transmission line rebuild started. Periodic inspections of the energized transmission circuits were completed, generally via helicopter flight patrols to confirm that there were no new issues. This slide makes reference to a dog leg where a line was installed from the transmission circuit to the industrial customer that served directly from the transmission line. This dog leg was a line extension that was designed and constructed prior to the transmission line rebuild in order to reduce the duration of the outages and maintain electric service to the customer during the line rebuild itself. It also allowed for a rebuild of the Salem-Woodstown circuit in 2 phases where a portion of the line remained in service by providing electric service to the customer while crews could safely work on the rebuild of the de-energized portion of the Salem-Woodstown circuit. There was a significant level of coordination required with the industrial customer, timing for the outage so as not to disrupt their manufacturing operations, construction along their access road to minimize disruption to deliveries and access. The facility was home to some avian activity, so we were sensitive to time construction around nesting and migration patterns. And the overall and very detailed collaboration with the customer and working in partnership with them over a period of years from project inception through detailed design and ultimately construction and commissioning of the project. This collaboration was a critical component of the overall project success. Taking into consideration the engineering behind the project and as part of lessons learned from prior storms such as Hurricane Sandy, engineering incorporated storm hardening efforts and National Electrical Safety Code into the designing the transmission line to be capable of withstanding winds of up to 120 miles an hour. Such design considerations include the foundation details and structural design of the pole, as well as increased clearances between phases and other circuits, vegetation, and other structures. Another item of note was that the project navigated the portion of the historic district in Salem City, as well as environmentally sensitive areas. The project team during the design phase was able to reroute portions of the line to avoid areas of the historic district away from pre-colonial era homes and some environmentally sensitive areas such as identified conservation easements. I'll go into schedule in more detail, but highlight here that all the critical milestones were achieved with final completion being slightly ahead of schedule. And next slide.
Before we move on, we do have a few
Sure.
questions, a few congratulations also. Question, and I'm not sure if you just answered it, but question on the wood poles being replaced by the steel monopoles. I heard the monopoles rated at 125 miles per hour winds. What about the wood poles? Also, what's the expected lifespan of each?
The wood poles, there are wood pole designs that are designed to meet that wind criteria, but they usually require a significant amount of guying. So you have guy wires coming from the poles either down and winds up leading to overall a larger footprint when you account for the guy wires. So with the steel monopoles, it's a monopole. There's normally no guying required, so the footprint winds up being much smaller than the disturbance you would have if you had guy wires, the down guys on wood poles. But we do utilize the wood poles on occasion where it's applicable. But the preference is to go with the steel monopoles is a more robust design. And as far as lifespan, this should last several generations, so probably close to 100 years. The existing line was from the 1930s, so that was close to 90 years old. So the steel monopoles are designed to have an even longer life. So the design is intended to be about 100 years.
Great, thank you. Jerry asks, what percentage of time would you say you spent planning this project? Do you connect to any renewable energy sources on the way in?
It was the transmission line itself was probably about 3 years of planning, from inception through detailed design, permitting, and so on up to the construction phase, and then about 9 months for construction. So over 3.5 years, full life cycle of the project. As far as renewable energy, there are solar fields scattered throughout southern New Jersey, and we do interconnect with them via our substations. It's usually not transmission voltage, it's usually just distribution voltage, 12,000 volts. But there are occasions where some of the larger fields, yes, they do tie into our 69,000 volt system.
Thank you. That's it for now.
Okay. The Salem-Woodstown 69kv transmission line rebuild was a $30 million reliability-driven capital improvement project to replace and upgrade the circuit. And touch on schedule. After 3 years of planning, engineering, property rights acquisition, and permitting, the construction of the project started in October of 2018. Construction starting after summer peak as temperatures become milder and overall system load and demands decrease. And the project had a targeted in-service date of May 31st, 2019, prior to the 2019 summer peak season. The project team was able to commission the project and place in service 11 days ahead of schedule. One of the large drivers for actually exceeding the project schedule, was by the contractor with input from the project team to leverage certain efficiencies during the construction phase. For example, managing composite matting installation phase, followed by proper staging materials ahead of start of civil work, construction of the foundations and setting of poles, which in turn stayed ahead of the overhead crews, leading to installation of the overhead conductor wire. I'll call this an orchestration that was a key facet to leveraging construction efficiencies. As for budget performance, the project did come in slightly over budget, which I'll detail in a later slide, but stayed within 10% of the authorized budget and in compliance with our internal governance. This was an engineered capital project. The project team managed through several project milestones prior to construction of the project, engineering design milestones, acquisition of property rights, environmental permitting, all before start of any construction activities. The capital expenditures included 236 weathered steel poles, 173,000 linear feet of aluminum conductor steel reinforced cable, which serves as the electrical conductor for the circuit, 58,000 linear feet of optical ground wire, which is the optical fiber composite overhead ground wire, a type of cable that used in overhead power lines and provides the function of grounding and communications. So these new facilities allow for retirement of the old line, which was the replacement of 333 wood poles, old copper transmission conductor, and shield wire. So the upgraded electrical conductor, which increases line capacity, provides for reliability and redundancy to carry additional load, for example, in the event of an unscheduled or scheduled outage of another transmission circuit. The additional load can be transferred to another circuit and maintain integrity and reliability of the electric transmission system. Plus, the optical ground wire provides a network communication path between substations.
We have a few more questions. Cliff asks, power outages due to storm are usually related to trees falling on power lines. Do the new steel poles go further to prevent this?
Yes, based off our new clearance requirements, we try to leverage, to the best of our ability, a proper level of right-of-way to provide adequate spacing between the pole structures and vegetation surrounding us. And we have a pretty robust, we have a vegetation management crew devoted to just maintaining the transmission and distribution circuits with proper vegetation management. It's something we look at pretty closely, planning transmission line rebuilds, looking at reliability of circuits, even for storm preparations to make sure that our maintenance is up to date.
Yeah, I'll add to that. The conductors on the new steel poles are higher, and while it's true that trees and flying debris do a lot of damage during storms, just pure wind. The original poles that were in there, while the line was from the 1930s, some of those poles had been replaced due to wind damage. So the wind itself can present a problem for a standard wood pole. The ones that John mentioned earlier are a pretty heavy duty wood pole and require some special trees to get them if you're going to get to 125-mile-an-hour wind loading.
Great. Someone asked, can you explain dog leg concept again? Is it secondary line?
Yeah, the dog leg, and I think, I'll say it was kind of a made up vernacular. It was something we kind of named it early in the design, and it just kind of stuck for the life of the project. But I do have in a later slide a little bit more detail on it, but it was really a line we built off of the transmission line circuit, a three-phase conductor line into the customer's facility while we had the line rebuild out, the line out, de-energized for the line rebuild. But it took a significant amount of planning to get that in place. How do we keep the customer service while we de-energize this circuit for rebuild? And we wound up being able to put a line in off of the circuit, build it prior to start of our line rebuild, and it enabled us to de-energize each side of the circuit from their facility so that we could rebuild the line successfully without having to keep them out of power for a disruptive amount of time.
Great, thank you. That's it for now.
Okay, this slide is intended to summarize a typical life cycle of one of our capital projects and is applied to the SALEM-WOODSTOWN reliability project. As previously mentioned, the Atlantic City Electric utilizes a prioritization model tool as a quantifiable methodology to evaluate electric system assets and asset system needs. The model serves as a tool to prioritize allocation of limited capital to where it's needed most. Recall that based on comprehensive inspection results and system performance, our SALEM-WOODSTOWN circuit was identified as number one in this prioritization model. Based on this model, a strategic long-range plan is developed and continuously refined for allocation of funds to execute capital projects. So projects are generally initiated with a very high-level work scope, schedule, and budget incorporated as part of the strategic long-range plan. We call this phase 0 stage. Phase 1 is then initiated, at which point an alternatives analysis is completed. For example, evaluation of existing transmission route versus an alternative route versus a partial rebuild. Maybe evaluating alternative solutions versus what are the impacts if we defer the project. So advantages and disadvantages of each alternative are considered. Once a recommendation is developed from the alternatives analysis, the scope, cost estimate, schedule are refreshed. And following an internal project authorization process, the project then enters phase 2, which includes detailed design, property rights acquisition, environmental permitting, procurement of long lead materials, and taking the project to bid phase. The project scope, schedule, and cost estimate again are refined and submitted for phase 3 approval, which is authorization to implement the project. Once phase 3 approval is in place, our contractors are retained and construction commences leading up to commissioning the project. So these stage gates serve as part of the authorization process, our internal governance to obtain consensus, as well as to provide transparency to the business on the recommended solution, the cost required to execute the project, and plan time for the project. In a sense, to demonstrate responsible investment capital. For a project of the magnitude and complexities of SALEM-WOODSTOWN line rebuild, the project authorization documentation via PowerPoint slides are very detailed and serve as a source document for the project plan, scope, schedule, budget, permitting requirements, risk register, and resource requirements, and so on. Next slide. To touch on PHIs and Atlantic City Electric's project management organization, the PMO consists of a project manager who is ultimately accountable for successful delivery of the capital project. Project manager has resources available to execute the project. Project execution involves extensive collaborations with various subject matter experts to include internal and contract resources in order to implement capital projects, engineering, environmental services, real estate, maintenance, construction management, government affairs, contractors, vendors, to name a few. The project management analyst, or the PMA, tracks certain project metrics and handles implementation of much of the procurement side, for example, preparation of contract requisitions and review of vendor pay applications. The analyst also maintains action item logs to ensure that critical path tasks are identified, assigned to an owner, and addressed in a timely manner. From the project control side, a cost controller assembles all the financial details for development of the project spend plan and with detailed financial forecasts, yearly plans, and total costs. Scheduler utilizes P6 project schedules to track critical project milestones, overall progress, and project metrics such as CPI and SPI. And finally, the estimator works with the project team and various stage gates to develop and refresh project cost estimates as we gain more and more clarity and detail in the project scope. I made reference to the cost controller handling the financial details and forecasts for the project. The cost controller takes details from the project cost estimates, line items such as estimates for engineering, materials, construction costs. These line items are incorporated in a detailed financial plan, which are in turn utilized for project spend forecasts. The project forecasts are reviewed at a minimum on a monthly basis and updated based on any new information. As the project develops, we normally gain additional clarity. For example, an engineering cost estimate gets updated once a firm service contract is in place for a consultant engineer. The cost controller works closely with internal resources and vendors to track spend plans to ensure accurate financial forecasting, as well as to track overall budget performance. For scheduling, we utilize standardized schedule templates that are used for comparison across similar projects. In this case, our Salem-Woodstown reliability project, and in the screen print on the slide, an overhead transmission line project. This allows for comparison of various project metrics across similar projects for example, the typical duration of a design activity or permitting requirement. A recent learning identified through the common template now implemented across our projects was to increase lead time between completion of engineering and start of construction, to allow for adequate time for bid phase and pre-construction activities and overall time allowance to develop a more robust plan for construction. In addition, and for the benefit of the project team, the common template allows for a level of consistency so that various project stakeholders are seeing information in a similar format and sequence when reviewing and discussing different projects. The P6 schedules are utilized to track the full life cycle of the project from initiation to closeout. Engineering milestones, for example, 30%, 60% issued for bid design packages, environmental activities for habitat surveys, permitting requirements, real estate activities, for example, for property rights acquisitions, bid phase, construction phase, and so on. So activities can consist of multiple steps, somewhat of a validation checklist before determining that an activity is indeed completed. The P6 schedules can get very detailed, but serve as a valuable tool in meeting with the project team to identify critical path activities and establish deadlines for action.
We do have a few more questions. Justine says, you mentioned property rights. What type of, what type of property rights did you have to acquire? What happens if you can't acquire them?
Normally, if the pole's in along roadside, a lot of times it's working within the right of way of the roadway. So we're working with whether it's municipal road, a county road, or a state highway. There are cases, and it is pretty frequent, where we are on private property and need to negotiate, or maybe established easement rights, so secondary property rights. So the easement rights will either work with the property owner to negotiate, and I found that probably 90+% of the time we're usually able to come to an agreement to negotiate appropriate property rights to obtain the easement from property owners as needed. So no, this was an existing transmission line. Most of our property rights were already in place, but to accommodate some pole shifts in certain locations, we did have a handful of locations where we were successfully able to negotiate an easement and obtain the property rights needed to install the pole prior, well in advance of construction in this case.
Great. There's another question. Was there any distribution center along the way that also needed to be upgraded for equipment refresh or capacity increase?
Yes, we do work with our distribution group, and clearly we wouldn't want to install a transmission line on the same side of the roadway with the distribution poles and just leave the distribution poles there. So we work with and we assess the condition of the distribution system. On this project, the distribution was old copper conductor that needed to be upgraded. So as part of the transmission line rebuild, we did upgrade the distribution system and attach the distribution to the transmission poles to consolidate and reduce the number of poles throughout the route.
Great, thank you. We'll move on.
Considering the importance of the circuit for rebuild of the transmission line, stakeholder management was a key component for overall project success. As a reliability-driven project, the reliability aspect served as a focus for stakeholder impacts. Environmental impacts, just wetlands, wildlife habitat, avian protection, soil erosion and sediment controls. We had coordination with regulatory agencies such as the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, the County Soil Conservation District, the New Jersey Department of Transportation, county, municipalities. And when mentioning county and municipalities, not just permitting, but also proactive outreach. For example, where will school bus routes be impacted? Because of this proactive outreach, county officials introduced us to representatives of the County Historical Society, which facilitated discussions leading to reroute of a small portion of the line around pre-colonial era homes. So we were able to work with the Historical Society, the county, and the rail operator and utilize county and rail right-of-way for the right reroute. Staying on topic with the County Historical Society, and based on the open dialogue that we maintained with their group, we were also able to make adjustments to our construction schedule so as not to disrupt the Walking Ghost Tour, which the Historical Society runs in the fall as an annual fundraiser. Ghost Tour made for interesting discussion with the project team when reviewing impacts to construction schedule and sequence. And in all modesty, the project risk register did not include mitigation strategies for paranormal activity. I'm going to move on to leadership. I'm still in stakeholder. Sorry, Jim. In part for transparency, when we're talking about leadership, so as to allow for visibility to the project and impacts, also to obtain buy-in and endorsement of the project justification, as well as authorization to proceed with implementation of the recommended project. So, individuals in leadership roles also make themselves available to help overcome project challenges, and from my own professional perspective, to serve as a sounding board for ideas and discussion of solution options prior to implementation. Internal partners, so many to ensure that a project of this magnitude and complexity is successful, including engineering for design, real estate for property rights, environmental, and when I say environmental, not just to ensure compliance, but also to be appropriate stewards. Government affairs for community outreach, construction management for contractor oversight during the construction phase, planning groups, network communications, project control, system operations, and the list goes on. So a strong effort is made to keep the project team engaged early in the project stages, with regular discussions with the project teams to provide a forum and leverage individual expertise and experience to share insights, identify issues, and develop solutions. Often several alternative solutions are evaluated, weighing advantages and disadvantages to each alternative. So while unanimity is sometimes unrealistic, it's been my experience that a healthy discussion to include a benefits versus detriments analysis generally leads to a consensus when selecting and moving forward with the solution to be implemented. Our external partners, our consultant engineers, surveyors, contractors, environmental monitors, suppliers, all serve as strategic partners to deliver the capital project. The contractor that was retained for construction of the project is a highly qualified and pre-approved contractor for Exelon, but the SALEM-WOODSTOWN line rebuild project was their first project on Atlantic City Electric system. So Atlantic City Electric and the contractor worked through expectations early on, onboarding and culture to successfully deliver the project. And such expectations include safe work practices, transparency in reporting any events, as well as project management practices with financial forecasts, overall schedule, Gantt charts, and short-term look-aheads, as well as the plan of the day. And then finally, of course, our customers. Overall, the project serves as an investment in electric system reliability for the benefit of our customers. On a project level, there's also a recognition of the disruption that construction activities will have for residents, businesses, churches along the transmission line route. So working with our government affairs, the project team hosted an open house prior to start of construction for residents along the route, as well as with municipal and county officials. And working with our surveyor, pole locations were staked ahead of the open house to give the residents a feel for where the poles would be located. So because the open house was held well enough in advance of construction, we were able to make several requested adjustments based on resident feedback. For example, accommodating requests for a minor shift of the specific pole location. Or in one location, we were able to transfer a customer's electric service to one of the new transmission poles, reducing the total number of poles in front of the property. Okay, next slide, please.
Before we move on, we do have a comment. Jerry says, great stakeholder ID and partnerships.
Thank you. Yeah, stakeholder management was a very, very intensive part of the project. I talked about environmental, but because it was such a critical component for planning and executing the line rebuild project, I wanted to devote a slide just to it. So, ospreys, bald eagles, and overall avian protection. The osprey nest was discovered during surveys prior to start of construction. So construction to be was scheduled around any timing restrictions so as to not disrupt nesting, mating, or foraging. The bald eagle's nest, however, was a new nest that was not present during pre-construction surveys. So it was discovered during our construction phase. So working with our environmental team, state agencies, and our consultants, we implemented the recommendation to keep a qualified individual on site full-time to serve as a monitor while construction was ongoing in proximity to the bald eagle's nest to ensure that construction activities did not cause any distress to the eagles. So we found that the eagles overall ignored us and no issues arose, but again, credit to the team to develop and implement appropriate measures to minimize impacts. As for avian protection overall, we utilize various deterrent devices to get incorporated in the design, such as bird flight diverters, which are line marking devices to deter avian collisions with power lines. We use certain cross-arm designs that discourage perching, among various other mitigation measures. Soil erosion and sediment control measures were implemented, for example, utilizing controlled construction entrances, sediment barriers, and appropriate grading. These methods help with proper erosion control, soil loss prevention, and overall stabilization of disturbed areas. Composite matting was utilized to provide a protective and stable surface for personnel and heavy equipment to access remote areas on the projects. And I think some future slides, I might have some photos, but matting systems can vary, but we utilize 8 foot wide by 14 foot long interlocking composite mats that can be configured depending on site access needs. And the project also took into consideration the conservation easements in the historic district with respect to access in these areas. Also largely avoiding these areas by rerouting certain segments of the transmission line where it makes sense to do so.
I have the perfect question for this slide. Lisa first says, congratulations on your win. She's very interested in the avian protection aspect. Please expand. Does this mean if birds land on the wires, they are not electrocuted, or separate towers were built nearby to entice wildlife bird nesting areas?
It's probably a mix of both, but if a bird lands on a single conductor, they're actually okay. So we make sure the conductor is adequately spaced to try to take into account wingspan. So if the bird spreads its wings, that it's not able to reach the other conductor, which would possibly be an issue. So some of that spacing between the phases of the circuit, that's taken into account to help with avian protection. And near the Salem substation, we were able to utilize an existing pole structure, an old wood pole structure, to help with the ospreys, to provide them with an annual nest if they so choose, away from our transmission line circuit, but in support of the habitat. To take a step back and discuss project management methodologies within our organization and as applied to the SALEM-WOODSTOWN reliability project. Our PMO structure would generally be classified as a strong matrix where the project manager is accountable for project-related decisions and outcomes. The project team consists of various subject matter experts that are generally aligned in a functional organization structure. These are engineers, environmental reps, real estate reps, communications, government affairs, construction management, system operations, among many other groups required to implement the project. So the organization encourages project managers to pursue PMI membership and certification. In management of electric system capital projects, project managers utilize a combination of PMBOK best practices and Exelon management model fundamentals. I'm going to take a moment on the Exelon management model. At least from a high level, it takes who we are, how we drive performance, what we do, and how we measure and improve. These are our vision, values, goals, plan development, implementation and monitoring, customers and stakeholders, financial discipline, management controls, and it gets more granular from there. We take lessons learned from prior projects to serve as feedback for implementation in the future projects. A philosophy of continuous improvement and specific to execution of these type of electric system capital projects. Touching back on the phase gates, phase 1 for alternatives analysis and project recommendations, phase 2 for detailed design, property rights acquisition, permitting, and procurement of long lead materials, and phase 3 for implementation, construction and commissioning. Phase gates are part of our internal project governance process and are also leveraged for continuous refinement of scope, schedule, and budget, as well as risk management, resource management, stakeholder management. Shortly following completion of the project, final commissioning and everything, a final meeting is held with the project team to serve as a forum to discuss project performance and revisit project challenges. We make certain that we emphasize things that we did well and discuss things that we would have done differently and identify learnings. So then normally 6 months to a year after project completion, a more formal post-implementation appraisal is developed to validate that the implemented project is providing the intended benefits, as well as to assess overall project metrics with respect to deliverables, cost performance, and schedule performance. This post-implementation appraisal also serves as an opportunity to share across the organization lessons learned that can be incorporated into future projects. With resource management, we've already discussed the internal and external partners required to execute the project from early in the project stages and evolving as we gain further clarity on the project details and challenges. Required resources are identified and enlisted to implement the project needs. Many of the internal resources that have been mentioned are engineering, environmental, real estate, construction management. We also engage our vegetation management group to complete required trimming in areas that would need to be accessed. Our system operations group to support electric system outage requirements, plus our external partners, various engineering disciplines, the geotechnical contractors for evaluation of soil conditions to help with design of the foundations, contractors and their subcontractors for construction of the project, environmental monitors that we utilize in the field for prompt identification and response to any environmental issues that develop, as well as to ensure that the project remains in compliance with permits. The project team utilized a risk register to identify potential project risks, associated impacts, and mitigation strategies. The risk register was very extensive for the project, considering access to remote locations and environmental impacts. So highlighting a few of the identified risks, the need for composite matting for personnel and heavy equipment to access remote areas on the project. Sequencing construction to avoid the osprey nesting activities. Some additional examples of where we encountered impacts on the Salem-Woodstown line rebuild was weather. How do we address weather delays? We confirm that the contractor has some buffer in their construction schedule, adequate staffing on the project, and can support working some extended hours or weekends to make up for any lost days due to weather. Another one was materials. The project encountered some minor field changes, reality of construction, that resulted in the swift need to obtain some minor materials. So we implemented a plan to work with other yards within the PHI organization and have materials transferred. So noting that the transmission line rebuild traverses rural areas, one other item identified in the risk register for this project was impact to agricultural activities. Working with property owners and farmers, we were able to prioritize and schedule construction activities after harvesting was completed for the season. So just a few examples. And stakeholder management, we devoted the prior slide just as project stakeholders. Again, something we identify early in the project stages and then evolves as the project progresses. As highlighted as previously, the stakeholder management was very extensive on this project with various internal and external stakeholder involvement. Communications management, taking into account timing and venues for communication with project stakeholders, working through our large accounts representative to serve as a liaison with the industrial customer. This allowed us to leverage and establish a relationship between the customer account rep and the customer and facilitate discussions on project details, information needs, and necessary dialogue to work through the project challenges. Other aspects of communication management included the open house and letters to customers along the transmission line route. We're working with municipalities to post information on the website, as well as coordination with our on-site representatives to promptly respond to any inquiries that arose during construction.
We have a question on methodologies. Ralph asks, did you utilize any lean or agile frameworks / methodologies while managing this project?
We probably weren't and it's a lesson learned from this project to be a little bit more deliberate in that approach. But I think when we were sequencing the construction and talking through those phases, how do we construct this project in an efficient manner, while still taking into account all the other variables, environmental restrictions, and impacts to the community, and so on, and be able to have a discussion as well in advance of construction to leverage those efficiencies. I mean, to a degree, yes, but opportunity for improvement. This slide serves as a summary of many what became project successes, but at some point during the project lifecycle were very difficult challenges that needed to be overcome. The various environmental components on the project, Osprey, Bald Eagles, wetlands, navigating the historic district, the outreach and dialogue with customers, especially those impacted directly by construction activities, coordination with various agencies, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, New Jersey Department of Transportation, the county, municipalities, as rail operator. We spoke about onboarding the new contractor on the SALEM-WOODSTOWN project, a contractor that's now a valued strategic partner. The aerial on the top right corner of the slide shows a conceptual sketch of the dog leg in purple-ish, where a line was installed from the SALEM-WOODSTOWN transmission circuit, shown in blue, to the industrial customer that's served directly from the transmission circuit. This dog leg was a line extension designed and constructed prior to the transmission line rebuild in order to reduce the duration of outages and maintain electric service to the customer when the line rebuilt itself. It also allowed for the rebuild of the SALEM-WOODSTOWN circuit in 2 phases, where a portion of the line could remain in service, thereby providing electric service to the customer, while our crews could safely work on the rebuild of the de-energized portion of the SALEM-WOODSTOWN circuit. As a reliability-driven project, the company's commitment to invest capital budget into critical electric transmission system infrastructure improvement project for the benefit of our customer. The use of traffic studies. They provided recommendations for spotting of the roadside transmission pole structures in areas less likely to be an impact on traffic. For example, taking into consideration site triangles at intersections so as to not block a driver's view when pulling out into an intersection. Also making sure that poles are spotted far enough off of roadways near curves in the road. In certain locations, guardrail was installed, and expanding on the topic of traffic studies. An item that underwent extensive discussion with project team early in the project stages was with spotting poles along roadsides. Far enough off of the roadway to minimize traffic impacts and reduce risk of pole hits, but not so far off the roadway to be a major encumbrance on the property owner. So a challenge that took extensive effort and discussion to find the proper balance. I discussed engagement of the internal project team, invested in and working to ensure successful delivery of the project. Talked about the high-risk evolution plan implementation prior to start of the SALEM-WOODSTOWN line outage and rebuild, making sure that proper maintenance had been completed on the other circuits and contingency plans were in place during the line outage and associated rebuild.
I have a few questions that are pertinent to this. Bob asks, what was the longest outage to any one person? Did people or the industrial customer lose power for days or only hours?
Working with the industrial customer, we were able to find a weekend where they could take a power outage, and when they're actually able to sync up some of their own electric maintenance on their side, on their high voltage equipment. So we were able to work closely with them to get that in alignment. So that worked out well. So it was probably about just a 2-day weekend, Friday evening and Sunday. So by Sunday evening, we had them restored. So 2-day outage with the industrial customer. Again, close coordination with them. As for customers, we do have an outreach directly with residential customers, but outages with the residential customers were a matter of hours. And with this work being done pre-COVID, we were able to complete this work. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. We're able to execute those outages normally during business hours when people are normally not home at their work. So.
Along the traffic lines, we've got 2 questions that I'll kind of rope into one. One is, did you get the police's help in managing the traffic? And then along the lines of poles, Larry asks, what happens if a car hits the metal poles? Wood poles would break, providing some measure of safety for the driver and passengers, but what about the monopoles?
Let me talk about the traffic. We do work closely with traffic control companies and local or state police in those jurisdictions for traffic control. So there are established standards in place for appropriate traffic control measures that we implement on our construction projects. As for pole hits,
so we have some internal engineering studies that indicate that it's not as dramatic of a difference as one might think on the surface. We've been looking at that closely. We do a lot to manage the location of poles, whether they're wood or steel poles, right? We're always looking to get our poles out of the line of traffic. as much as plausible. The reality is it's a balance, right? Nobody really wants the pole up against their front door, so that you can only go so far off the street. Definitely one of the areas that we focus on constantly is the safety of the public as well as our employees. And again, our internal engineering folks have looked at this pretty closely and determined that there's not a significant difference between the two.
Thank you. In the interest of time, we'll move on. We do have a few questions, but we'll circle back to them.
One of the major takeaways from the project and a point of pride for the project team was the integration of a highly qualified and experienced contractor, but a contractor that was working on Atlantic City Electric system for the first time. And since completion of the Salem-Woodstown line rebuild project, the contractor has worked successfully on several substation, transmission line, and distribution line projects with Atlantic City Electric. Has also stepped up to provide critical support for restoration following storm events. They're now a strategic partner and valued resource for us and for execution of our complex and large-scale capital projects. So to ensure a successful path to integrate the contractor, Atlantic City Electric, and the Exelon family of companies hold safety as paramount, that every project can be constructed in a safe manner. We're working with the contractor leadership and their crews. A full-day safety meeting was conducted to reinforce the culture of safety. As part of the safety meeting, yes, we held some presentations. We also conducted a dialogue with the crews to discuss the work plan, identify potential hazards, and how best to address them. That engagement by the crew was a key component to safe and efficient performance of their work, and also reinforcing reporting expectations should safety, environmental, or human performance event occur, and to extract learnings from any such events. Again, emphasize a culture of approaching the work in a safe and deliberate manner and drive event-free performance. So in addition to environmental health and safety plans, the Exelon organization utilizes event-free performance tools as techniques that can be effectively utilized during work activities to minimize adverse outcomes and events. So to support a safe and error-free work environment, such techniques include, for example, a job brief with the crew prior to start of work, prior to start of work, and discuss all relevant aspects of the planned work for the day, emphasizing site-specific hazards and appropriate mitigation strategies. Another example is the STAR method: stop, think, review, and act. Peer checks, another example, and another one is a 2-minute pause, a work practice of pausing or stopping work prior to engaging in a critical or high-risk task and ensuring that nothing has changed since the initial pre-job brief. So just some examples of how personnel are encouraged to complete work in a safe manner. Getting a little bit more granular in some of the project takeaways, lessons we learned from the project that we shared for consideration to be applied with other transmission line rebuild projects within our system. First and probably foremost was access to remote locations. We'd utilize composite matting, and as you can see from the wet ground conditions in the photo shown here, to access some of the more remote locations on the project where the circuit was far from roadway access. While composite matting is an extremely valuable tool available to us, we now conduct a more detailed assessment for such difficult to access areas and consider alternative methods. With respect to the project budget, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that the project remained within 10% of the approved budget, but the project did have an overage of 7.5%. That overage was driven mostly by the use of composite matting, exacerbated by record precipitation during the construction season. There's a bit of two-dimensional thinking when developing the matting plan and quantifying the number of mats and associated costs, but we did not take into consideration the potential need to have to stack mats on top of each other in certain extremely wet conditions. A third dimension with that, which added to overall project costs. And aspects that we now shared with engineering, construction management, and estimating for consideration in future projects that may face similar site conditions. Some secondary budget impacts included a design change for a small portion of the project from overhead to underground. And also additional costs were incurred for use of traffic control in several locations, which was initially unplanned, but was definitely warranted to support safety for our crews and the public, as well as allow for efficient installation. As project manager and one ultimately accountable for budget performance, the cost overage does sting, but I'm grateful to be part of an organization where the leadership endorsed the additional costs, reinforcing the culture of safety and enabling implementation of appropriate measures to ensure that the project was completed in a safe manner.
Yeah, and John, before you go to the next slide, I just want to kind of accentuate the point that this was the rainiest construction season that we had seen in our company history. And the picture you see here shows some of the conditions that they had to navigate through. So to bring this thing in on schedule was an impressive task with all the challenges that we had.
And one final item on the slide, as pictured in the right-hand photo, we frequently utilize switches located at irrational locations in line with the transmission line to allow for any needed isolation of the circuit. These switches are generally manually operated. Taking into account the limited access and remoteness of the Salem-Woodstown project, we believe that this project would serve as a good application for installation of motor-operated switches. This would allow for operation of the switches from our system operations control room, for example, if there was an urgent need to quickly isolate the line. But physical installation of the switch was very intensive, along with the need for an electric distribution source for the motor operator, the need to connect it with our communications network, plus physical adjustments to ensure that the switch was in proper alignment. Overall, we felt it was a good application, but quickly became overly complex.
We have one question pertaining to budget a little bit. Dave asked, were you able to recoup some of your costs by recycling all of the old copper wiring?
Yeah, we do get a scrap credit towards the project for some of the assets that have some level of scrap value. But in the overall project costs, that is accounted for. But in the $30 million capital project, it's a very small percentage of the overall credit to the project. Okay. Now, lessons learned on a more general level to share with the project management professionals. I'll start with sharing my thoughts on diversity, equity, and inclusion. While a project team consisting of a room filled with 20 John Travelinis may sound wonderful in my self-delusional mind, it would certainly be a disaster when it comes to effective execution of a project. Welcoming and exploring different viewpoints promotes innovation and drives powerful outcomes. One of the great joys of my role is having individuals in the project team share their perspectives, leveraging their education, training, backgrounds, and lifelong experiences. Their input, while maybe not always leading to the unanimity, yes, conflicts arise, but their input facilitates a healthy discussion and drives towards conclusions and recommendations, and in general, consensus toward a final solution that's in alignment with common goal. Seeing individuals at their best, going through hardships with them, and overcoming challenges, and coming out better for it on the other side. So from the journey comes growth.
I think we lost John for a second. You there, John?
Focus.
Oh, there we go.
Yes. Good.
Yep, you're good now.
Okay. And touching on community and reinforcing the customer-centric focus, a reliability-driven project showing the company's commitment to investment in the electric system infrastructure. For this specific project, recognizing the impacts of construction activities to residents, the industrial customer, permitting agencies, and historic district. We found that the proactive communication early in the project stages facilitated a dialogue to reveal items that we would not have probably would not have been recognized otherwise. And taking into account this feedback, we were able to make appropriate design adjustments well before starting construction. So the extensive planning on the project was of significant value in advance of actual construction. Resource management, risk register, communications management, even identifying and leasing a yard for laydown materials and show up for contractor crews. All combined with the technical expertise of the project team led overall to a well-planned out project. And yes, the reality of construction in such a large-scale, complex capital improvement project, challenges arise during the construction phase. We conducted regular check-ins with the project team in a consistent format to discuss construction progress and overall project status. And we review the look-ahead plan and discuss any project challenges. So within the engagement from the project team, we were able to make appropriate adjustments and work towards resolution on any identified issues. And recalling Frank Salata's presentation from this morning regarding the 6 triangular slices of the circle, providing a basis for defining and assessing factors commonly associated with the project manager's circle of influence. This is your leadership, management, technical project management, business acumen and strategy, agility and adaptiveness, critical thinking, all came into play in this project to some degree to ensure success. And I especially took note about Frank's statement about core leadership, courage, optimism, respect, and enthusiasm. Items that help facilitate full team engagement and encourage team performance. So, as a team, to have the optimism to overcome project challenges. Okay, Jen, I think next is a drone video. A drone video showing the weathered steel poles along the roadside. The top wire is the optical fiber composite overhead ground wire type of cable that combines the function of grounding, also provides a network communication path between substations. The next three wires are the aluminum conductor steel reinforced cable, which serves as a three-phase electrical conductor for the 69 kV circuit. Below that is distribution voltage class electrical conductor underbuilt on the transmission poles. And underneath the distribution line, there's some communication cable. It's probably telephone cable. So the video illustrates some of the roadside poles along the route, the portion bypassing the historic district by utilizing rail right of way. Also, the coordination with the industrial customer to take into account access to their facility, their delivery schedules, manufacturing, office buildings, plus some rerouting of the circuit to avoid conservation easements. And in this video, we're seeing some of the more remote areas in the project several months after construction. These areas were where we utilize composite matting so that equipment and personnel could access the work zones during construction of the project. While conditions were very wet during the construction phase, you can see that the conditions have since been restored and returned to their natural state. You may barely be able to see installed along the top line the bird flight diverters, which are the line marking devices to deter avian collisions with power lines. Feels like an episode from the Smithsonian Channel Area America series, Rural South Jersey edition.
All right, we have about 20 minutes left and we have a good amount of questions. So I'm gonna get you guys some questions.
Okay.
Let me start at the bottom. Jerry said the process looked very predictive, but it must have iterative aspects. Do you have an example?
Yes, all of our registers were an evolving process. Early in project stages, we knew nothing about the Salem County Historical Society or the impacts from the project. But networking and being proactive with the community outreach, working with municipal and county officials that could connect us to help with our outreach to connect us to other individuals impacted on the project. That was very beneficial, and the management documents and the registers evolved from there. Taking that into account, working closely with the industrial customer with their manufacturing schedules and when they would have downtime, be able to accept an outage. So that was all an evolving process leading up to construction.
Great, thank you. How hard was it to authorize replacing wood pole with steel pole on public ROW or row?
It can be a challenge on some projects. Benefit on being in the rural area, it's just not as densely populated, and we were able to work pretty close to the community and utilizing the weathered steel pole to try to blend with the environment, and the aesthetics with the background. On this project specifically, they were very receptive, especially knowing it was a reliability-driven project. So to make integrity and reliability of the electric system. But we do take that into account in more densely populated areas where the feel that steel poles may be more intrusive. So we do take that on a project-by-project basis.
Yeah, we do a lot of public outreach in advance, and we work with the community. I will say that the wood equivalent to those steel poles, the footprint of those wood poles, when you get there, they're a class 6 heavy pole to get to the same strength as a steel pole becomes pretty significant. And then all of the guying that John mentioned earlier, whenever you have a corner, has a significant impact on the community. We're also constantly looking at new ways to do what we do. We have this pole of the future concept that is geared towards trying to minimize the footprint that we're starting to move towards now. We have one project in flight with a portion of that in. With what we do being as large as we are, If you move too quickly on changes, you get yourself into a place where if it didn't work as intended, the cost can be extreme. But it's not as big of a challenge as one might think on the surface, going from the wood to steel. Once folks understand the rationale, as John said, the reliability behind it, and what the alternatives look like.
Got 2 questions about poles. Easy one for you guys. What is the height of the monopole? And then second question, can you clarify the usage of the fiber optic cable installed at the top of the poles?
Height of the poles can vary depending on how much is going to be underbuilt on the pole, whether it's distribution or communications cable. But in general, probably about 85 feet tall on average. And as far as the OPGW wire, again, it's a combination of, it provides a dual function of serving as a static wire in a sense, to provide a level of lightning protection to the overall circuit. But it also serves as a dual function as a network communication cable between substations.
Yeah, that question is one that I think I've asked probably 20 or 30 times myself. It sounds like magic, right? How do you get a wire at the top of the pole that's going to withstand a lightning strike, but can still manage to be the equivalent of a fiber optic cable? I was pretty skeptical myself. We have that. We have 2 different types of that, ADSS and OPGW, all throughout our system, and we've been successful. It manages through lightning and still is our communication path. It seems counterintuitive, but it works.
Great. Mr. Mark asks, was there a decision framework designed ahead of time about what accommodations you would agree to? For example, the dog leg on the industrial customer, adapting to the historic district, and other items that may have added time and cost?
And I'll start with the industrial customer. And with the 3 years of planning and through detailed design before we even started construction, and the conversations with the industrial customer were very extensive to get a feel for the understanding of how their facility operated and what their constraints would be. Their manufacturing schedule, so the line outages, so to not disrupt their manufacturing operations. They have water line underground in a certain location. We want to make sure we spot our poles, so to avoid any underground interferences. I made reference they have a couple martin nests that they have a certain migration pattern, so we work with them and make sure we're sequencing well in advance, so to not disrupt those migration patterns. So various items. I could probably talk for 20 minutes just on coordination with an industrial customer. And with the Historical Society, we were just fortunate to be networked very well and try through our government affairs to stay connected with the municipal and county officials who know their communities, and they were able to connect us up with a few members of the Historical Society and started a dialogue with them, and we started to hear their concerns and to see if and accommodate them where it was mutually beneficial to do so. And that reroute, and I'll be transparent, I was personally very uncomfortable with trying to construct transmission line poles in front of pre-colonial era homes in the historic district of the city. So we were fortunate enough to be able to work with the county and the rail operator and utilize a rail right of way and design a reroute very early in the project stages, properly capture that.
Yeah, I think the key to success there is early communication. Like John mentioned, we have pretty good relationships with a lot of the stakeholders through our government affairs team. And the earlier you have those conversations, the most you can do to minimize the financial impact of anything that you're going to do to accommodate what you're dealing with.
Great. I have a few software tool questions that I'll combine. Greg, he thought he missed which software tools you used, so we're just asking to reiterate that. And then Mary Jo is asking if the PM software that you used was customized templates, like AKA lockdown version control ones, or can the PMs customize configure based on the project?
It's a very complex answer, but I'll start with the P6 schedules that we use. P6 Primavera as our standard for project schedules. We utilize templates for different types of projects, whether it's a substation project, a transmission line overhead project, a distribution line rebuild project, and various others. So that they're in a consistent format. So we kind of get visibility across to the performance of different but similar projects. And keeping that template in a consistent format, we find is beneficial to stakeholders, so that they're seeing the information in a consistent format. So it's not a heavy lift to try to find where a piece of information is in the overall sequence. Other templates, I made reference in the project authorization process that we utilize. It's a templated PowerPoint presentation, but it pulls from Excel spreadsheets and various other pieces of information. Again, get some consistency, so things flow in a consistent format. So when the project justification and from that the project plan are developed, that they're in a similar format. And again, so you can kind of measure across different projects to see if there's find commonalities and opportunities for improvement. And again, for the benefit of the stakeholders, consistent format, so it's readily recognizable. And there are various other tools, business enterprise tools for financials, and various others we utilize as appropriate.
Great. We have a few more questions. Some comments. Very impressive effort. Congrats. Another comment. Project success is inspiring. Congratulations. Got a question. Just curious, since the project ran through winter and ended early summer, was the line sag in the transmission lines inspected in both climates before deployment?
Yes, because we built in different segments, we did take into account and very detailed and deliberate approach with keeping visibility to the side that was going to remain energized while we had the other segment de-energized for rebuild. So working with our vegetation management, make sure the vegetation management is in a robust condition, is up to date. We work with our maintenance department to conduct helicopter flight patrols to see if any maintenance is required on the line prior to us starting the de-energization and the rebuild process. And then even while the outage started in the construction phase, we still conduct periodic flight patrols just to make sure that no new issues have arisen. And if so, we can properly we have a mitigation plan to properly address.
Perfect. I have one more question in my queue currently. When will you start to go underground, or are there technical issues with doing that?
The preference is to stay overhead for and where it makes sense to do so. There are strategic locations, and one near, in this case, near the substation, it made sense to go underground for a small portion for various reasons, just because there were so many interferences overhead, and there was a pretty clear path to go underground, which made sense to do so. So that's what we implemented. A little bit of cost adder, but overall, for the success of the project, we felt it was the right recommendation. But I guess overall, the drive is to stay overhead, and there are a few main drivers, and one of them is if there's an issue or an outage, if the line's overhead and visible, when we do an inspection on the line, we're able to identify issues more promptly just because there's visual. So if there's an issue with an underground line, it may take time to isolate and locate where the fault is. It's a little more intensive. And there is a cost factor that underground can be costly. So in the interest of appropriate allocation of capital in an efficient manner, we tend to try to go overhead where it's appropriate.
Yeah, I think the third factor there is the heat generated by transmission voltage conductors underground can be significant as well. And so the complexities of going underground, it's not as simple as if you were in some lower voltage class. So transmission in particular is difficult. Cost is a big factor. It can be an order of magnitude higher to go underground depending on the conditions. So it's not an easy choice to make to go underground.
Great. I've got two questions that just came in. How did you adjust with the COVID situation? What changes have you made?
Want to take that one, Dan?
Yeah, well, this project was completed before COVID. Sure, John. This project was completed before that. our attention to detail around what we do with our workforce, given the pandemic, is a huge effort. I actually personally have been on phone calls weekly with our chief operating officer to walk through each of our projects, not just on the transmission side, but in our substations and our distribution work as well. So we've done some deliberate things around making sure that crews are not commingled in particular, making sure that folks are driving in smaller groups, if not individually in trucks, making sure that we have good sanitary facilities around, that there's enough sanitary facilities around, right? Instead of having, if you look at a substation, we might have had 1 or 2 porta-johns. Now we've got separate wash stations for the separate contractors. We could go on for probably an hour, hour and a half just on the things that we've put in place, and small details too. If you take a look at our substation projects, one of the issues that we had to contend with early on in our substation work is we have to protect the gate for a substation project, make sure nobody gets in there that we don't want in there for their safety and for the safety of the crews that are working in there. So we normally have a gate that's locked, and having that common touch point was something that we had to eliminate. So now we have a standby person who monitors a gate during the active construction time. As I said, probably could go on for an hour, hour and a half on the COVID preparations. It really kind of makes you rethink from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, how you do everything that you do to try to minimize the potential. If you look at our project work and the work that, John completed here, we have similar projects going on now. The quarantine potential and what that could mean to the project, as well as one of the reasons that John wanted this done before summer is that we need our full system back to meet our summer load and make sure we have the redundancy the appropriate redundancy you would want to have in an electric transmission system. If you quarantine a crew for a couple of weeks because one person gets it and you have to shut down an entire job, the ripple effect could be significant going into summer.
All right, we have a few minutes left, and I think I have the perfect question to end on. Kelly asks, what are the qualities that make a project manager successful at Atlantic City Electric?
There's a strong need for leadership skills to be able to engage and get the best out of the project team. So, whether it's engineering to keep them engaged, keep visibility, knowing the deliverables they're accountable for, and to make sure that they have the tools and resources in place to be able to execute that properly. And I've found, and maybe I've been fortunate, but I just found that the level of engagement from the project team has been it's remarkable. Nobody wants to see anybody else fail. That somebody's failure or somebody else's failure. So success from each of us leads to the overall project success. And I've been grateful that to have good people, surrounded by great people, and to have them keep their commitments and to be able to deliver on milestones in a consistent manner. And when there are issues, we identify them. And, kind of get away, we used to call it be above the line, to get away from the finger pointing and blame and work and identify, okay, here are our issues and how do we get to a solution to keep momentum going on the project and make sure overall it's successful.
Yeah, I'll say it largely has to do with attitude and aptitude, right? If you have the ability to manage a project, that's one thing. Having the attitude for success, the attitude towards the inclusion of the team and respecting other people and respecting what they bring to the table drives a lot of the behaviors that you would want to see somebody to be successful as a project manager. And we're, as John said, fortunate to have a great team around us in the project management organization. But the pictures that you see in this slide here are the folks that touch the project as well. I will say I've worked with a lot of teams, and the Atlantic Electric team is one of the best that I've worked with. We joke that we get on each other's nerves, but it's always trying to get to the right solution. And those conflicts we all respect as being a healthy thing to help us get to the right answer.